Hi, welcome back to the channel where I attempt to give you code that you can copy and paste into your own personal projects. As usual, I have all the code pre-written, so if you're impatient, you can simply go to the GitHub link provided below and copy and use the code right away. However, if you want to stick with me, I will be going through each and every single line of code with clear explanations of how the code works. As you can see today, what we'll be working on is a form, a React form where you have several inputs and a button where you can click to submit a form. The first field here is an email field. It's an email field where it validates your input and sees if it's correct email. So let's see, if we type in some letters and it doesn't resemble an email, it will return an error here that says email invalid. However, if we add gmail.com here and make it a valid email, the error goes away. There's also a username and password field. Now that we've seen the demo, let's go through the code and see how it works line by line. First of all, I have a form demo component where this component simply centers my demonstration here, and it renders a children called form. Here we have our form component. We see that as a React component, and we import two statements here. And the first one is another component, and the second one is our data. Before we go through what form does, let's go and take a look at what a form config is. As you can see, form config has several functions and some data that are getting exported. Let's take a look at the data here. It's essentially an array where several objects are embedded into it, and these are the data that are getting rendered on the form eventually. As you can see, the first one, we have an emailed object where we have the label as the email, the name, the placeholder, and several other things. But the important field here would be the value field, where I set it to an empty string to begin with. And there are some validation rules here. As you can see, the first validation rule that we have here would be an email valid rule, and the second one would be a required rule. Where did these rules come from? From the functions above. We have a create rule function up here, where, as the name implies, it creates a rule for the field. This create rule function is what we use when we want to create a rule for our fields. Concretely, let's say we have this required rule that we want, where we want to tell the user this field is a required field. We give it a name, where we call it required here, and an error message, where it says it tells the code what should be printed out if the input is invalid. This one simply says the input name required, and input name is an argument which we take in. And then more importantly, we have a validation function here. This validation function takes an input and compares its length to the number 0. This simply means if the length is not equal to 0, it is valid. If it's not equal to 0, it is valid. If it's invalid, that means the length is equal to 0. Next, we have our email valid rule, which is quite similar to the required rule, except that we have a different validation function here. And this one is a regular expression which tests whether the email is a valid email or not. So that is what form config is. Now we know what form config does, let's take a look at what a form does. Form itself has several states As you can see here, we have our error state, a loading state, a data state where we store initial data, as well as a field validities state. What field validities does is it keeps track of the field validity for each of the data for the fields. As you can see, back in form config, we have 3 fields in this array. That means field validities would have 3 initial Boolean values for each of the form config data. Concretely, here we have 3 true values to begin with. And that is why when we refresh the form, all of these fields are valid. Next, we have our form is valid value. This value is computed from the field validities array, and it simply checks if all the fields equal to true. If any of them is not true, then form is valid is false. And that is the value that we use in the form to give it the right color that you see here. We see that there's a username required error here, and there's also this red background and red border that we give the form. Next, we have our onSubmit function. Here, I simply have a dummy function where it says submit a form and then the data value. Let's try it out. As we submitted a form, you can see that we have our gmail.com email, our username A, and password A. So that's what submit does. And then we have a handle submit function, and this is the actual function that we pass to our form. First of all, it prevents default, and this is necessary because on a single page app, which you usually build with React, we need to prevent the browser from refreshing. Next, we check if the form is valid or not. If the form is not valid, we want to set an error that says form is invalid. And we can try this out. And you can see that when we submit the form, and because the form is invalid, we set the error to form is invalid, and then it's shown down here. If it is not invalid, we submit it again. It's successful. Notice how we have a set loading a true here every time before we simulate an API call, and that is what gives this loading state to the button. Once the API call has succeeded, we set the loading state back to false, and then of course we wrap this around a try-catch block to see if there are any errors when we submitted the API call. After all that, we return a form skeleton component as well as the submit error value down here. So this submit error down here is what you saw before. That is this. When I click submit, this is what this block does. And this is highly customizable because you can change this to any color you want. For example, let's say if we do not like it to be red, we change this to blue. We save it, you can see that the color has changed. And you can do any CSS here inline because of the awesomeness of Tailwind CSS. Now let's take a look at form skeleton. So form skeleton takes in a few values that we give it here, as well as the yellow colored functions and a handle submit function too. Here we have our form skeleton component. So what does this component do? This component takes in the props and it renders a form HTML tag, which has 2 children in there. Notice how we pass the handle submit handler to the onSubmit function, and then we give it a class name that is dependent on the value form is valid. And this is what gives the background a red color when the form is invalid. As you can see, I have form is invalid and a question mark here. That simply means if form is valid is true, in other words, if form is valid, then we give it this CSS, which is outline blue and background slate. That is the color that you see upon refresh. If form is invalid, we give it the string here after the colon. As you can see, it would be a red outline and a background red 100 tailwind class. That is what you're seeing right now. Next, we have our form input fields. Also, if you're just wondering, this is just some prop types to validate the input and props, to validate the props that are being passed to this component. Next, we have our form input fields and form submit button class. Let's take a look at the submit button first, since it's a lot easier. It's a lot simpler. So the form submit button takes in a loading state, and it simply renders a button that is disabled if it's loading. This means if I press it right now, I cannot press it again while it's loading. Press it, I cannot press it anymore because it's disabled. And this is useful because you don't want to allow your user to be able to submit several API calls to your backend when they're clicking on the button. What does it render though? It renders a spinner when it's loading. If not, it renders the login text here. So how does our spinner class look like, you might wonder? It's simply an SVG. So this is our spinner component. It takes in a size where it uses to determine what the size of the circling circle is. And it's simply an SVG class, an SVG HTML tag, where it circles like that. So let's go back to our form skeleton. Okay, we've talked about the form submit button. Now we want to look at what form input fields do. Form input fields take in all these props, and it returns essentially an array of form input field. Object.values data means that we take the data object and we return only the values of it, and then we map each of those data to our children component here, which is form input field. We take this, we pass it a key, and this is necessary because React uses the key prop to determine which component has changed. And then we map the data. We map all the data that we need in form input field from here to the component. So essentially, form input fields render form input field, many of them. Finally, we have the meat of our component here. Form input field again takes in all these props, and now we'll take a look at what each and every single line of these does. So we have our prop types validation again. That's fine. And then we have our mounted. So what does this mounted equals to useRef false do? This is a very common trick that we use in React for functional components. As you can see, right now, if I have an empty field, the form, it does realize that it is an invalid field, and I render this username required, and I turn the background of the form to the color red. But you might wonder, why doesn't it do that in the very beginning? This is because when the component mounts, mounted here checks whether this field is initially mounted. If it is initially mounted, we do not validate the fields. Therefore, the error is not shown. Concretely, this is what it looks like. We have our mounted ref. Ref is simply a reference. We use effect. Use effect is a, if you don't know already, it's a React hook that gets called when a component is mounted, and you can pass a dependency array to it. So when the component is mounted, we call this use effect hook, but we have an if check here. What this if check does is it checks if the mounted component is true or not. This means if it is initially mounted, then this will return true, this expression here. Why is that? Because mounted is set to false initially, and because we have an exclamation mark or a bang here, we see that, okay, initially if it's false, then this is true. Then we want to set mounted.current equals to true. And then we simply return, which means we do not validate. However, on the next change of value, again, value is what I type into the input. When value changes the next time, like this, validate is being called. And if validate fails, then I get this error here. So that is what mounted.current do. Now we want to see how we can change the actual value of each input. So let's go down here and see what happens when we render and return this component. You can see that we return a div which contains a label. A label would be what the labels here are. And of course we have an HTML4, and what that does is when I click on email, this text here, it will focus me onto the input. As you can see, when I click on email, it brings me here, username, it brings me here, and password brings me here. Next, we have our input tag. Our input tag has the name, the ID, and then the value. So this value is what is getting changed every time we type in here. How do we change that? It's in this onChange function. But before that, let's talk about the type real quick. The type here is important for a field like password. As you can see, the Edge browser automatically detects that this is a password input, therefore it hides it like that, and it generates this eye where you can look at it or not. And then we also have our disable equal loading, and this is also important because what we want to do here is when we submit the form, we don't want to allow the user to change what is in the input here. I submit it. As you can see, I cannot type it until it's being submitted. And of course, we have our placeholder if needed, and the error message is rendered down here. So this error message is what you see here, and that is getting rendered down here if the field is invalid. Now to the most important part, the onChange function. So how does this work? This works by taking in the data field. Remember, the data is what we got from form config in the very beginning. It's passed all the way from our form down to skeleton, down to input fields, and now in the input field component. We take the previous state of the data, we spread it into a new array. This is necessary because if you do not do this, React will not update your UI, although the data has changed. We need to create a new array, spread it in there, basically copying a new array using the previous states. And then we do the same for the object at that index. Why do we have an index? Because form config exposes us a data that is in an array form. We only want to change that one array. that one element in that array. So we set the new data's value to whatever we type in there. That would be e.target.value. And then we set is valid equal to true, because every time when we type in the field, we want to set the valid field to true again. Therefore, we can revalidate the field. And we set error message to nothing, because is valid equals to true. Then we set new array at that index to our new data, and then we return our new array, which is what will get updated in the data state. As soon as we update the value, remember we have this useEffect hook here. When the value gets updated, what happens is we call this validate function as long as we're not initially mounted. What does this validate function do? Let's take a detailed look here. First of all, we declare a variable called all rules passed. We set this to true, and this is useful because it allows us to only update the field validities field down here if all the rules did not pass, or if it is different from what the field validity was before. We'll get to that in a bit, but let's take a look at this. We have our validation rules. Where did we get this from? Remember, in our form config, we had exposed a set of validation rules for each input field. So this validation rules, we loop it over, we do a for each loop, we take each and every single rule and we try to validate it against the value here. If the validation fails, that means we have to update the isValid property on that data, on that field's data. And also we have to update the error message for that field. And how do we do this? We simply use the setState function again. We take in the previous state, we take in the current data by spreading it out into a new array. We take it at that index, set isValid equals to false. We take the index's error message and assign it to this rule.message, and we return the current data. This will update the validity of the field as well as the message. And if any of the rules fail, what we're going to do is we're going to set all rules passed equals to false. We do that for every single rule, right? And if all the rules passed, then all rules passed would still be true because we never went into this if block. Otherwise, all rules passed would now be false. Next, we go into this if block here. So what this does is it compares our previous field or our current field validity to this all rules passed Boolean value here. And we only want to update our field validity if and only if the current field validity value is different from the all rules passed Boolean value. For example, this is what we have here right now. And we can see that username as the field validity equals to true because it is valid. It is still valid when I do a backspace, but we know that if we do a backspace one more time, it is going to tell us that the username is required. So what is going to happen is, currently field validity is true, but when I click on backspace, this validate function is going to run. The validation rules for username, which there's only one for username, which is the required rule, it's going to get validated against the value. And we see that the length of the input is equal to 0. Therefore, this block here gets updated. This block here gets updated, and all rules passed is set to false. Remember, our field validity right now is true, and all rules passed is false. Therefore, this block gets executed. when this block gets executed, field validities of this field gets updated. That's why you see the username required error here. How do we do this? It's pretty similar to setting the data. We simply spread the previous state into a new array. We take it at that index. We set it to what it wasn't before. And then we return the new field validities. So this is how the fields get validated when I type into it. And I think that's it. Again, once we have all our data validated successfully, we can click on this button here, and when I click on this button, remember in our form skeleton, handle submit gets called, and handle submit is defined up here. The only thing that you need to change here would be the function on submit. As you can see, when I click on submit, again, it shows me that data is down here. Okay. You might wonder that if my form is valid in the very beginning and I click submit, it still gets submitted. So how can I prevent this? Well, you can prevent this if you simply check whether all these values are empty or not. If it's empty here, then we do not let the form submit the values. However, that's a design choice. It depends on whether you want username to be required or not, and whether the email has to be valid or not. And all that you can do in either handle submit or in form is valid. So if you want to just copy and paste this form, what you really need to change would be your on submit function here. Simply do an API call here, and if it's an async await function, put the await function, put the await keyword here and the async keyword here, and the last thing you need to change would be the form config. If you want more fields or more rules, you can simply create it here. It will automatically get populated in the form here. And that's it for me. Thanks for listening. See you next time.